Hey, Andy, you want to kick us off or should I do so?
I'll go ahead and get us started.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I know people are still filtering in, and that's fine. I just want to welcome everybody to this October 2024 session of Conversations in Transportation. I'll turn it over to Dr. Hummer in just a second. The normal announcements, if you haven't been to one of these sessions before, welcome. Glad to have you here. The normal announcements are if you have any questions that you think of during the course of the conversation, please use the Q&A function here in Zoom to type in your question. That way we can keep track of it, make sure we don't miss it. We'll get to the audience questions around 12:45. So just make sure you get your questions in sometime in the interim. We will be sending out the PDH and evaluation forms sometime either later today or sometime before the end of the week. If you have any questions about any of that, please feel free to email the operations account or email me. And with that, I will turn it on over to Dr.
Great, Andy, thank you and welcome everybody. Glad that you're here. We are excited today to talk demographics, population, very interesting topic, I think. First, let me say thanks to our sponsors for the Strategic Initiative Council and the Young Members Council of NICSITE, Adam Fisher and Morgan Rosamond as the chairs respectively. Thanks so much. And thanks to our sponsor companies for making this possible, really, for your great support of NICSITE. You saw some of the company names on the title slide on the way in, so we really appreciate that support. Today we are talking about demographics in North Carolina with Dr. Nathan Dollar. Nathan is the Director of Carolina Demography at the Carolina Population Center at UNC Chapel Hill. His work helps leaders across North Carolina make sense of population level changes throughout the state. Most recently, Dr. Dollar served as research scientist and project director for the Dynamics of Extreme Events, People and Places, the DEEPP survey. He has decades of experience in research and program implementation across North Carolina and abroad. Nathan previously served as U.S. Peace Corps in the U.S. Peace Corps in El Salvador and as executive director of a farm worker health program in Western North Carolina. He's a native of Wilson. He received a BA in sociology and Spanish from Western Carolina University, MA in sociology from Colorado State, and a PhD in sociology from UNC Chapel Hill. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And we're, no, you know this, but for the audience, mostly we'll be thinking about the next 30 years or so, which is our time horizon in transportation planning and design. But any good thoughts you got about what happens after that will certainly be welcome. Let's start with talking about the U.S. What's your best estimate of the U.S. population at the moment?
Yeah, so currently there's the Census Bureau estimates there's about 337 million people in the U.S. population.
Okay. And that number's going to go up within 30 years, right?
It will. It is projected to continue to grow throughout the next approximately 30 years. To probably, we're supposed to reach, we're projected, and again, these are projections and they have assumptions that are built in, but and those assumptions may not hold. But we're projected to reach a population high of around 370 million in about 2080 before edging downward by 2100. But I mean, again, you know, of course, the further out we get, the less accuracy we have, right?
Yep. So some of our very youngest members listening in today might actually still be around and still be practicing transportation in the year 2080. It's going to be a interesting time to be a transportation engineer, planner, a civil engineer when the population peaks or starts to decline. Birth rates are, of course, a big driver of that, and our impression is that those are different in different parts of the US.
They are. When we think about birth rate, so there's different ways that we can measure birth rates. There's different measures. There's, crude birth rate. The one that you want to pay attention to is the total fertility rate, or the TFR. And what that is a measure of the average number of babies a woman is expected to have over her entire reproductive life if she experiences the age-specific fertility rates of that period, right? And so a TFR, or a total fertility rate of 2.1, is considered replacement. The United States has hovered around replacement fertility since the mid-1970s. And we fell below replacement fertility during the Great Recession of 2008, and we've been consistently below since.
Wow.
And it varies across. There's a lot of variation. There's more variation within state than there is across states, but there's certainly variation depending across states and places within states.
Okay. And do you have a number in mind overall US at this point?
Right. So currently in the United States, I believe we are around 1.67, 1.66, which is well below replacement.
Interesting. And then, of course, the other, correct me if I'm wrong, there's really three big factors at work here: birth rate, death rate, and immigration.
Right. That's correct. Yeah. So I always joke that demographers are three variable hacks. We study fertility, mortality, and migration. There's two ways to enter a population. You're either born into it or you move into it, and there's only two ways to exit a population. You either die or you move out. And so those big three are the ones. And so when we think about population change over a particular period of time in a particular geography, we think about it in terms of the components of change, and that is natural change, or the total number of births minus the total number of deaths, and then net migration, where we factor in the total number of people that moved out and the total number of people that moved in. And then we usually, at the national level, of course, we only focus on international in-migration, but at the county level, or state and county level, we look at domestic migration patterns as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I said immigration before, but I really should be thinking migration, because people move out as well as moving in.
That's right. Yeah. So we just call it net migration, and that's total number of people that moved in, and factoring in the people that moved out.
Yeah, good. So the second big factor, then the death rates. Our impression is that those have also been pretty stable in the US over the past couple of decades.
They have been, although there have been a couple of increases in death rates, and depending on certain characteristics, age and educational level in particular. Back in 2018, there was a famous piece published by two economists, Case and Deaton, focused, I think it was called, as a paper that was titled Deaths of Despair, which showed that in the United States, white adults with a bachelor, with less than a high school degree, their mortality had actually increased due to alcohol-related liver disease, suicide, and drug overdoses.
So yeah, so variations within the various groups.
Right, and there's historically have been and continue to be wide disparities in mortality by race and ethnicity and sex.
I remember a paper, not in one of your professional journals. It was in a popular press, but 10 years ago or so, musing about the death rates, and they were making the point that if the death rates continue to fall, that we would eventually get to the point where we would essentially be projecting immortality. The death rates would fall.
Yeah, right. And I remember when that came out a couple of years back. And in fact, when I was it was about that time that I was doing my PhD studies here, and there's two different camps in the demography world. One says that there's no limit to what we call E0 or life expectancy at birth in a life table, was what is E0 is the column that's life expectancy at birth. And then there's another that says there are clear biological limitations to how long we'll live. And in fact, in recent years, there was just a piece on public radio not long ago about this, about there's new evidence that suggests that life expectancy may be leveling out.
Even in, let's say the European countries or Japan, where their life expectancy is much higher than the US, they're seeing it starting to level out in places like that too.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah, that was an interesting, caught my eye for sure. I remember life expectancy increases more than a year each year. If I got it right. Wow.
Well, not in recent years. I have to look at what it was in recent years, but 2018, in fact, saw the first time since in over 100 years that the life expectancy in the United States, overall life expectancy, declined. Now we have bumped back up since then. Of course, the pandemic was was an anomaly. And if you look at life expectancy in the United States, of course, from 1900 to now, it's kind of a steady increase, and that's, economic development, increases in our knowledge about sanitation, and decrease in infectious diseases, et cetera. So life expectancy has continued to increase. And if you look at, the 28, I think it was 1918 was the Spanish flu. You see the blip there, and you see the blip in 2020 and 2021 as well. Now, I mean, that was an anomaly, an anomalous shock event that happened.
It'll stay with us for the next 60, 70, 80 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly demographic data trends have leveled out since then, but that blip that in the time trend will always be there.
Yeah. And then the third big element, as you mentioned, migration, and that does matter, as I understand it, right? Looking at the sort of US overall, a big difference between how the US is doing and a lot of European countries, or Japan, for instance,
Right.
is we have net immigration.
Right. And, so fertility, the decline in fertility and below replacement fertility is not unique to the United States. That is an international phenomenon. And it's what we would expect, considering what demographers call the demographic transition. As economies develop, as economic and educational opportunities open up, particularly for women, infectious diseases and mortality from infectious disease decrease, and access to contraception and family planning opens up. We expect to see, and we historically have, decreases in infertility. And then, when people, the decision around if to have children, whether to have children, when to have children, and how many children to have are culturally laden. And they're very complex processes. And so when people grow up in a low fertility context, ideas about whether to have children, ideal family size, when to have children change. And so what we call the second demographic transition is when we fall below replacement fertility and stay below replacement. And in fact, most demographers worldwide will agree, there's a general consensus that it's not likely that we'll ever come back above replacement fertility again. Now, in the United States, I mean, compared to our high-income peer countries like you're talking about, our fertility levels are still much higher than they are in Scandinavia, other Western European countries, Japan, South Korea, these places. And that is primarily due to the fact that we've had in-migration. So the demographic processes are interrelated. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but because we've had so much in-migration in the United States over the past 30 years, 40 years, most people who move worldwide move for purposes of work. And so they're in prime working ages, which overlap with prime childbearing ages. And so that has kept our fertility not as low as some of our other high-income peer countries. And to give you an example, since the 2020 decennial census, for example, the United States population has grown by about 3.5 million new residents. Of that 3.5 million increase, 27% was due to natural increase or more births than deaths, and 73% was due to international immigration.
That's roughly 2 million. Yeah, okay. Interesting. Let's focus in on North Carolina. We're, I think, most of our audience today is living and working and most interested. Your best guess of the current population of North Carolina?
Yep. So, so typically when we think about the population, just to go back a little bit, we look at the mid-year population. So we look at populations at the July 1 population. So, the 2023 estimates from the Census Bureau's Population Estimates Program are the latest available. And according to these latest estimates, the NC population is 10 million, about 10.8 million people.
And now here's the money question for those of us who work in transportation here. What are we looking at in 30 years then, North Carolina population?
Right. So, well, so my friend and colleague, Mike Klein, Dr. Mike Klein, who is the North Carolina State Demographer at the Office of State Budget and Management, his office is legislatively charged with producing the official estimates and projections for the state and all 100 counties. Mike updates these annually for the time being, and using what we call a cohort component method, where he looks at births, deaths, migration, other local contextual data that he factors in, development and stuff like that. Mike's office projects that we'll reach 12.4 million by 2035 and potentially 14.2 million by 2050. We don't project out past that currently.
14.
0.2 million by 2050.
2050. Okay. That's a lot of people.
That is.
We're gonna be more crowded.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that we're going to grow. I mean, I typically would say, and these models are updated annually, which is a good thing, because things change. For example, we were talking about the components of change. Last year, the state grew by about 139,000 new residents between July 1, 2022 and July 1, 2023. Of that, only 9% of that was due to more natural increase or more births than deaths. And conversely, I mean, as necessarily 91% of that was due to net in-migration. And that's both domestic and international migration. And most of that was domestic migration. And that was up from 5% the year before. And that's not necessarily because we had so many more babies. It was because the mortality burden from COVID-19 was less. And so, I mean, we're looking at over 90% of all of our state's population growth due to in-migration. And so that's important for our projections, because in the United States, over 99% of all births and deaths are recorded. We have really good vital statistics. 99% of all births or deaths that occur within the borders of the U.S. are documented in our vital statistics, our birth certificates, our death certificates. And so we feel very confident in those data. Migration is the most challenging component of population change to measure. And so, when we make these projections, we make assumptions about the levels of migration, and they can change.
Yeah, much more on a whim, I imagine, or that's the wrong word. There's trends, there's lots of factors going into that decision at the personal level, and then those kind of mount up when we're looking at groups.
I would say that migration I think it's safe. It's fair to say that of the three components of population change, that migration is perhaps the most susceptible to kind of external shocks or external changes that happen more rapidly. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Better way to say it. Very good. Very good. One of our stalwarts, Ron, asked a good question in the Q&A. I'm gonna come in with, here. Asking how does North Carolina population compare with other states? And then as far as the migration goes, I think what he's getting at there is, it sounds like we are expected to grow. We have been growing and we're expected to grow faster than most other states.
That's correct. That's a great question. So between 2020, of course, we have the decennial census, right? That happens every 10 years, and that is, mandated by the U.S. Constitution, and that's an enumeration of every resident within that, every person that resides, regardless of nativity or citizenship, every person that resides. Between 2010 and 2020, North Carolina was the fourth fastest growing state among southern states. Now, there's 4 general regions that the Census Bureau divvies up the country into: the South, the West, and so of those regions, the South is by far the fastest growing region by leaps and bounds. Sometimes we refer to the southern states as the Sun Belt. You've seen most of the population growth happening in the southern states. Between 2010 and 2020, North Carolina was the 4th fastest in population growth among southern states and the 6th fastest growing nationwide. And so we're growing faster, and we've grown faster than the nation every year since 1970. So we are among the fastest growing states, but it's due primarily to in-migration.
Yeah. And thank you to the audience members coming in with questions here. There's another couple of good ones I'm going to come in with at the moment, kind of dovetailing on. Ron was asking about driver age population changes. And then in a related way, Shashank was asking about working age population. So is there, do y'all keep statistics on that, or is there an easy way to track those 2 kind of subgroups?
Yes, so we do the estimates and the projections are produced by different characteristics. Certainly age is one, and those prime working ages have been growing because, again, most of the migration. Now, just to be clear, all migration is not labor migration, for sure. There's other reasons that people move. People move for family reunification, and I'm sure we'll talk about here in a bit. People move for retirement, what we call amenity migrants. But most people who move for purposes of work, and so they tend to be in those prime working ages, which is between 25 and 44. And as far as the driving age population, I don't have that data in front of me, but we certainly can look at population growth by age over time, without a doubt.
But I'm hearing you. That's if migration is the kind of prime factor here, that's also our driving age. The people moving here in their 20s, they'll be driving with us for the next 50 plus years, most likely. So gotcha.
Yeah, and I think an interesting phenomenon, and again, right now I don't have empirical data to support this. I do have anecdotal data because I have a 20-year-old son who delayed driving several years more than when I was a kid. I know, and currently, of course, we have graduated driver's licenses now, which are a very sound policy and have been demonstrated to save lives, without a doubt. But I think that there is some evidence that this newer age cohort does delay driving.
Yeah. Also, I've got a couple of nieces that they're in their, I think, early 30s now. Never had a license, never want one. They want to live in big cities, walk everywhere. Go figure.
Right. I mean, there's few places in North Carolina where that's a viable option currently. But yes, I think I think it's something to look at of looking at delaying of driving over time. I think is something that would be an interesting phenomenon to examine.
Christopher, another good question from our group here. Do you happen to know which state it is that is expected to grow the most in the U.S.?
Oof. I don't right off the top of my head, no. I do know that most of the growth is going to be concentrated in the South. I do know that. I don't know exactly which state is projected. It would depend on what our time frame is, et cetera. But you know, North Carolina, Texas, these southern states, we're growing faster than most other places.
Good, good. Um, let's see if I get anything else on North Carolina here. This is really interesting to me. I hope to our group. I think. Oh, yeah. There's just one that sort of relates to our transportation interest. Is do highway crashes? Yeah, we're very concerned about fatalities. North Carolina does not do well for traffic crashes, but from a demographic point of view, do highway fatalities show up in the numbers?
Yes, well, and it would depend on age group. In fact, you know, so the probability of dying in an automobile crash decreases with age, right? And I was saying earlier about graduated driver's licenses are empirically proven to reduce adolescent and young adult deaths, right? And so historically, when we look at child mortality or early life mortality, as a matter of fact, there's a paper that I published a few years ago with Robert Hummer, and so, your brother, and it's about state level differences in early life mortality. And we're looking at between the ages of 1, because infant mortality between the ages of 0 and 1, that's a whole nother ball game. But between the ages of 1 and 24, early life mortality. And because most of those deaths are from what we've referred to as external causes, and because they're external, they're also preventable. And these are automobile accidents, deaths from firearms, the most of which are suicides, drug poisonings, drug overdoses. There's some drownings in there and some other external causes of the homicide as well. Historically, up until very, very recently, and I don't have exactly when we crossed over, but if we're looking at the whole population, not by race and ethnicity, automobile accidents were by far the #1 killer of a cause of death of people under the age of 25, right? In the U.S. as a whole, that's transitioned over to firearm deaths are the #1 cause of early life death. But automobile accidents are certainly among the lead. I think it's got to be the second leading cause of death now for people under the age of 25. And so it does, but it decreases with age.
We're going to still keep doing what we can do to reduce that, but it's I guess even helpful to hear that it kind of it matters
Right.
demographically as
Well,
well.
and I think, the regulatory environment has a potential to make a big impact on that. Car safety, the age of cars, the safety regulations that cars are obligated to have. Again, the graduated driver's licenses, road design, of course, is something that is outside my level of expertise, but would certainly be squarely in y'all's wheelhouse. But its effect on the automobile related mortality is something that certainly can be empirically examined.
Good, thanks. Let's talk about regions within North Carolina, and we've had a couple of questions pop up on that anyways, heading there. Talk about the coastal counties and sound side counties for a bit. Our impression is that the coastal counties have grown well in the past couple of decades and probably projected to continue to do so. Are you agreeing with that?
Not across the board.
Okay.
So, in the southeast for sure. So, Brunswick County is among the fastest growing counties in the whole country, and certainly the fastest growing in North Carolina. New Hanover's growing, Pender County's growing, Onslow County's growing, Carteret's growing, but not as quickly as Brunswick or Pender. But when you get up to the Outer Bank, Currituck's growing, Dare's growing, but when you get into the northeast corner of the state, I mean, so Mainland Hyde County, or Hyde County is not increasing in population. And a lot of that northeast corner, many of those would be, Sound Side, coastal counties are decreasing in population.
Any expectation that that basically Brunswick fills up and people start to move to Hyde because it's still kind of near the coast and, kind of got some amenities there, but Brunswick gets too expensive.
I don't know that there's a scenario where people stop moving to Brunswick and move to mainland Hyde County. No, I don't. I don't think that there's a scenario where that happens. But anything could happen, right?
Sure.
It's all based on historical assumptions. I think that a lot of the Ocracoke is part of Hyde County, of course. But I think that just there's geophysical limits to how much Ocracoke can grow. And I also know, just as part of my work with the Dynamics of Extreme Events People and Places survey, Hyde County was one of our research sites. The ocean is encroaching on many of those communities on mainland Hyde County, and they flood more frequently, and the flooding is more intense and not just from extreme weather events, from recurrent flooding, from nor'easters and from king tides and such. And so even folks that live there now are having to rethink the infrastructure of their homes and the potential for raising their homes or retreating. And so as far as Brunswick County is concerned, I think that there's still a lot of land in Brunswick County. I was in Brunswick County yesterday, as a matter of fact. My parents lived down there. They contributed to the very old median age of Brunswick County, which is the oldest county in the state with a median age of 56.6, which is astronomical. But all the growth in Brunswick County is not just because of the post 65, but that's certainly the highest growth we see in the post 65 age group. But there is growth in the working ages. I think you see a lot of growth in Leland. And for those of you who know that area of the state well, you see a lot of growth in Leland, and some of those are working age people, many of whom have families, and that Leland has become somewhat of a bedroom community for Wilmington and other places where it's gotten really expensive to live, and so people will move to northern Brunswick and commute in, and I think that you're likely to continue to see that for some time.
And then along those lines, my cousin's in Michigan looking for a place to move to get out of the winter, considering North Carolina getting turned off by the hurricanes that seem to be a threat, or the rising ocean levels. Did that start to affect migration, perhaps?
It's certainly possible. I would say that we don't really have good data on that as of now. But certainly climate is an increasing. There was a report that came out the other day that climate is a bigger factor in younger working age people's decisions to migrate than it ever has been, and that's what we would expect. I think it's something that we'll have to continue to monitor, and where people move. Up until people used to call the Blue Ridge Mountains a climate haven, and that was always misguided. I lived up in Jackson County and worked in Jackson, Macon, and Swain 20 years ago when Hurricane Ivan came up through the Gulf. That was the last big one to come up through the Gulf, and it was really bad, but it was nothing like Helene. Helene was, I think, the French Broad River back in 2004 crested at 14 or so feet, and I think it crested at 19 or so feet during Helene, which is astronomically higher.
Okay, so we got probably a ways to go to stem that tide, though.
Right.
Got a good question in the Q&A along these lines. Urban to rural migration within North Carolina, or I suppose the reverse, but I'm thinking of people retiring from Raleigh or Charlotte to Brunswick County, or maybe from Raleigh to your old stomping grounds in Wilson to be able to afford a house, right?
Yeah.
Expect some of that?
So during the pandemic, there was a slight reversal of the decades-long trend of increasing urbanization. So most of the population growth in North Carolina has, over the last several decades, has been in our urban areas, without a doubt. And that's a global phenomenon, increasing urbanization. There was a slight reversal during the pandemic, and I think in many outlets it was overstated. There was some talk in popular media outlets about there being this massive reshift back to rural. That was short-lived, and the data is very clear that we have gone back to pre-pandemic trends and patterns in terms of urbanization and rural to urban migration. I don't think what I do think that, and Brunswick is not really. I wouldn't consider Brunswick a rural county. Mostly, it's predominant. It's not one of the most rural counties that we have. Most of the growth is in our urban counties, and it will continue to be. I mean, if we look at the state demographers' projections for the next 10 out till 2035, only about 6% of growth is projected to be in our rural areas. Now,
Okay.
to your question earlier, to your point earlier about places quote unquote filling up, I don't know if I would use that terminology, but I think that we are already seeing sprawl because affordability is becoming an issue in our urban cores, and you're starting to already see, certainly, if we look at the triangle, you're already starting to see a lot of growth east. Johnston County, and I think that. Wilson County, my hometown, I think my home county, I think it's close enough to the urban core that you're likely to see some potential sprawl there. Wilson County lost population between 2010 and 2020, but has since started to tick back up. And so I think that there's the possibility that it will become a place where people choose to move to because of the affordability, but may work in closer to Raleigh or other triangle urban centers. I don't know that Wilson will become a place for retirement, but anything's possible.
Yeah, but place like Wilson, sort of those outer rings around Charlotte as well. Thinking of the
Absolutely. And
Monroe.
you're starting to see growth in these suburban places.
Yeah.
And they're not entirely urban, they're not entirely rural, but you're starting to see a lot of growth in those places. I mean, Johnson County is one, Union County is one, around Charlotte, Mecklenburg. And so you are starting to see that kind of that sprawl. If people move a little bit further out because it's more affordable, you can get a lot more house, you can get it cheaper. And so I think you're likely to continue to see that happening. Absolutely.
But the expectation is really, especially Raleigh and Charlotte, really will continue to grow in the next couple of decades, mostly from attracting migrants looking for jobs.
That's correct. Yep,
Yeah.
that's correct. And well, there's tremendous growth projected in Chatham and Lee and Alamance, which some people would certainly call part of the triangle. I mean, what the triangle means depends on who you're talking to. Right. There's multiple different definitions of what constitutes the triangle, but certainly other Piedmont, Greensboro is gonna continue to grow. Greensboro, Winston-Salem will continue to grow, but the bulk of that growth is really is going to be concentrated in the Raleigh Triangle area, Charlotte, Mecklenburg.
We worried as transportation people that Charlotte and Raleigh are turning into the next Atlanta or Houston, at least as far as traffic congestion goes, and becoming less livable in that sense. But Atlanta and Houston are continuing to grow too. There seem to be other factors at work, right?
Yeah, and I think, for folks that are in y'all's field could perhaps learn from some of what has happened there and maybe make some adjustments, and perhaps we could maybe not have some of the obstacles that they've had with their rapid growth over the past several decades.
And what I'm getting a sense from you too, that Raleigh and Charlotte, Greensboro would tend to have younger age distribution then too, out into the future.
That's correct. And they already do. I mean, you look at, we mentioned earlier about age, and I think that I say a lot that I think that aging is perhaps the biggest policy issue that we have, and that we face moving forward. We're getting older. We're older than we ever have been. North Carolina's median age is 39.3, I believe, right now. Slightly older than the country as a whole. But it varies widely across counties. And so, I mentioned earlier, Brunswick County is the oldest, and that's because of the in-migration there of retirees. Carteret's also one of those places that's had a lot of in-migration of retirees, driving the age structure up in the median age. But Brunswick and Carteret are kind of anomalous because of the in-migration of wealthier, typically whiter retirees. Most counties of the oldest counties in North Carolina tend to be the most rural and the most economically distressed. And so that poses, significant policy considerations and challenges related to a host of issues, but transportation being a big one.
It is, people, aging out, not being able to drive, losing their driver's license at some point, and losing their mobility if they're in a place where there's no public transportation option. It's a big, just to name one. There's others in our realm too.
Yeah, there's some great work out of the University of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken, about kind of this intersection between autonomy, aging, transportation, and some good case studies out of there. If I can find it, maybe I'll send you, and you could send out to the group.
That'd be great. Yep. And then let's talk a little bit more about the mountains, kind of continuing to look at the different regions here. But is it too soon to estimate the effect of Hurricane Helene on the future prospects of the mountain counties?
It is. I mean, we could, actually, Mike Klein, the state demographer, just published a piece about that was a very thorough piece on what do we know from previous extreme weather events and their effect on population changes in places that were affected. It's likely that you're going to see certainly some blips. We won't even have the data until like the July 1, 2025 estimates, which will come out in March or so of 26. So it's going to be a while before we know what happened.
Yeah.
There's already lots of anecdotal data about people leaving, going to stay in other urban centers within the North Carolina and perhaps outside of North Carolina with family. Places where they have ties.
Right.
If we look at Katrina, and that's kind of Katrina and Andrew and some of these major hurricanes that have affected other places, we see short-term effects on migration, but then very shortly after they recalibrate back to pre-disaster population levels. So you're going to have some churning. You're going to have some people moving out without a doubt. And I think it's important to note, I mean, just the level of destruction from Helene and especially on the transportation infrastructure is, I think it's safe to say, unprecedented in North Carolina. And so
maybe compared to Katrina in Louisiana, or, I mean, we're
well, my colleague who has been studying the effects of the 2004 Indonesian tsunami for the past 20 years said that mentioned to me in passing that this was the extreme weather event in the United States that reminded her the most of the level of destruction that happened in 2004 after the South Indonesian tsunami. So just the force with which that water was moving and the level of destruction was just it's immense. And so I think it's going to be a long time before we know what the mortality toll was. I think we're a long ways out from knowing that. We do know that there's going to be people that are going to move out. Many people will return, especially those that have some type of family ties to the area. You'll likely see a big in-migration of foreign-born workers this is what happened after Katrina. These are the people There was a big influx of Latino workers and to New Orleans and the surrounding area post Katrina, because those are the people that do the rebuilding. They
Yep.
work in construction, and so you're likely to see that. But again, it's hard to say. We can't say with any certainty now. We can say what we expect to see based on historical evidence, but it's going to be a while before we know.
Sure, sure. The mountains, the mountain counties before Helene were, our impression was generally growing, but not as much as the urban Piedmont of North Carolina, and not as much as the coastal, Brunswick and New Hanover and such. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yep. Swain saw a slight decrease. Swain County is where Bryson City is. Last year they saw a slight decrease in population, but in general, most of those counties out, I think Avery saw a slight, or Mitchell and Watauga also saw slight population decreases last year. But in general, most of the mountain counties are growing slightly.
And our impression was mountain counties were also a place that were attractive to retirees, the legendary halfbacks that would move from the north to Florida for a few years and then go halfway back to the Asheville area, for instance. So again, we'll see what happens with those. There's some truth in the numbers to that impression.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it varies by county. I don't think every county in the western part of the state has seen the level of amenity migration and retirees, as some, but there's certainly truth to that. There's no doubt. Now, how that will be impacted by Helene we'll have to just wait and see how that happens. But there's certainly, the mountains are a destination for people who retire, and that's both people from people who may have worked in the Northeast, moved to Florida, as you're talking about, but also from, other places within North Carolina.
A reminder to our audience, we got a few minutes left. If you have a question you'd like me to route to Nathan, please put it in the Q&A. Got a couple there now. Nathan makes a good point there, reappraising risk for home insurance due to storms. Looks likely and might encourage people to leave Florida. Does that make North Carolina even more attractive, or the same thing happens here? Maybe they're looking yet for somewhere else. What do you think?
Florida for the past several years, Florida has been one of the top sending states of domestic migrants. So people are already moving here from Florida.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't venture to say that most of them are making that decision based on climate. But perhaps that factors in, right? It's likely that it may. I think it's going to depend on the area of the state where people move. I mean, I think it's, people may be less likely to purchase a home that's on one of the barrier islands or right on the coast. And I know that regulations are changing about disclosures of flood risk and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that changes people's decision making about where to move. But I do think that I think it's totally plausible that people will make the decision to move out of Florida and move to parts of North Carolina. But most of those people who move from Florida that move to North Carolina are going to be moving to those urban centers. And we just know that. That's just because that's where most people are moving to. And so, yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I moved to North Carolina, to Charlotte, as a 28-year-old for a job. So here we go.
Right. I mean, most people worldwide move for work.
Yeah. Joanne asked a question in the Q&A about high-speed rail from Charlotte to Raleigh, and I'm going to rephrase that a little bit in terms of, like we talked about before, maybe a slight trend for younger people to like to move to urban area where they don't need to drive. Do we really see that in any numbers that matter in Charlotte and Raleigh?
Again, I don't have that data in front of me, and actually I need to look and see. I know that the current population survey, so there's different data sources about migration. So the ACS, American Community Survey, is the premier source. And that's a sample size of 3 million households. So it's a very large sample size, and it's collected continuously. And they've got questions about where you lived last year, your place of residence the year before. So that's one of our data sources. The current population survey, which is as much smaller, it's collected in collaboration with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's a good source of data, but you can't get really below the state level because it's a much smaller sample size. They ask questions about why you moved. I need to look and see what the best source of data is on these transportation perceptions and preferences. Because I feel very confident that they're out there, and I do think that it's reasonable. It's a plausible theory that younger people who maybe more educated, higher skills, that want to live in urban centers and want that convenience of not having to drive a vehicle and the parking. And I think that that's certainly a plausible theory. I don't have the empirical data to substantiate it as of yet.
Yeah, as I said, we've all got the anecdotes, but yeah,
Right.
having the data would be a good step up there. Nathan, give me some hope for the rural counties of North Carolina. And we don't want to name names here, but there's several dozen out there that have been losing population for decades, and wow, it just looks pretty grim for their prospects, at least now. Anything on the horizon there you can be hopeful?
Well, first of all, I would say that population decline it doesn't necessarily have, people frame, declining fertility as this crisis. Most demographers would advise, and myself included, would advise against that framing. This is largely what we would expect based on our understanding of demographic transitions. I would say that certainly in my experience talking with communities where population has been declining, there are changes that are coming, that are here, and changes that are here, and changes that are going to be coming. But across the board, we are inevitably going to be getting older. And also there are limits. I mean, at some point, there's limits to where people can move from, and so I would advise against necessarily framing it as a crisis or grim, and lean into what what the projections, the likelihood of what the population is going to be, and adjust. So for example, there's several folks, demographers, who make, I think it's a solid argument that while population decline can be challenging, right, to even wrap your head around, there's also the potential for it to create opportunities for fairer, more economically just scenarios and economic structures. And I think, I was talking about earlier about how aging is perhaps one of the biggest policy issues that we face, creating that infrastructure and that policies and those practices that allow people to age with dignity, to age in place. And I think that those are what we need to be doing now. Now, there are some places, to your question, I don't foresee population ever turning around. And that is a reality, I think. Now, anything can happen. That could change. There are places where I would say that it's not likely to change, and that those places are likely to continue to experience population decline for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's fewer economic opportunities, and so you have an outmigration of prime working age people who are moving to our urban cores in North Carolina and elsewhere for economic opportunities, and then that causes kind of a double whammy in terms of population decline, because those are the people who are also the most likely to have children, and so that causes the population age structure to get older, and old people don't tend to have very many children. And so you kind of have a double whammy of outmigration and declining fertility. And so there are places where I don't foresee there being any turnaround in terms of the population patterns. Now, I think that has the potential, like I said, to open up other opportunities for how we're operating though.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other big assumptions that go into your work to making these projections that we haven't touched on yet? I think you've mentioned several that really kind of help me get at it, but anything else that we really haven't mentioned?
No, I mean, again, we look at the vital statistics, the mortality, the fertility, the births, the deaths. We also make assumptions. We look at county. I know we look at county development and propose and approve projects, and we do make assumptions about, okay, this development here based on historical patterns is likely to produce this many children. And so we make assumptions about the age structure of developments and how that's going to change the population over time. So I mean, and you know, all of our projections are based on assumptions, though. We need to be very clear about that, and it's possible that those assumptions may not hold.
In transportation, looking at 2050, my standard is whatever number I see, plus or minus 30%. You have the same sort of thought?
I mean, again, I like 30 years is a long time.
Yeah.
I usually try to of course, the further out, the less precise,
Sure.
right? I think 10 years is normally about as far out as I like, and that's why we update. We're always updating the models, but I think that's probably fair.
Yeah, that's tough, but it's still better than throwing a dart, right?
Absolutely.
Got some good questions in sort of the last couple minutes here, so gonna shoot a couple to you if you quick answers perhaps. Dale asked, do the highways matter? Like for instance, the widening of I-40 getting to Johnston County recently, would that factor into projections that y'all would make?
No, not really.
Right.
I mean, no, and you know, there's a lot of folks that anecdotally said that Carteret was going to be, the population was going to grow because of I-70. I've always thought that that's not necessarily, you may see more tourism down there and more second homes, but I don't think that that's likely to have a large effect on the permanent resident population here now.
And Loretta asked a similar question. I think the new interstates, the I-42 heading toward Carteret or the I-87 heading through Elizabeth City. At not.
I don't know. I would venture to say that it's not likely to have a huge effect on domestic migration.
Yeah. And one other question came in about Franklin County to the northeast of Raleigh. I guess I would think they're included in the same kind of discussion as Johnston or the sort of surrounding counties.
Yes, they're last year one of the fastest growing in the state. It grew about 3.5% last year, which is among the fastest.
Good.
Yeah.
We have just a couple of minutes left. My standard sort of last question for you is, being a professional demographer sounds like a really interesting way to make a living. Did you always want to be one? How did you kind of fall into that? Get a few words for our younger members about.
Sure. Well, so demography typically stems out of sociology. So I really fell in love with sociology because of kind of the understanding how external social forces impact our individual lives and vice versa. So I really got really deeply embedded in sociology, and then I had a career in migrant health and was really interested in the upstream social determinants of health and how they shape population health disparities and outcomes. And then that was kind of a natural segue into demography, because population health is so inherently tied to demography. And I also been a public servant forever. And when the opportunity came to work at and run Carolina Demography, I jumped on it. And so I'm got really lucky and happy to be here and be able to serve.
And obviously, it's so important for folks like us and lots of others out there that you know the decisions we make are
I also
based on.
I'll say really quickly, there's a lot of applied demography master's programs that don't require the undue punishment of getting a PhD. And so there's several of those, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about it. Just reach out to me.
Fantastic. And then with that, it's 1 o'clock and we are out of time. Nathan, thanks so much. This was fascinating to me. I think to we're getting some good comments from our participants as well. We had another hour worth of questions for sure. So But
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
yeah, good, good. Thanks. Thanks to our participants. Again, thanks to our sponsors. And I think with that, Andy, back to you for to close us out.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Again, we'll get you your PDH and evaluation forms within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for your emails for that. And as a reminder, we do have the Nick Site annual meeting in Chapel Hill coming up in just a few weeks. Registration is currently open and will remain open for at least a little while. I think it's open until sometime around the 14th. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out. Other than that, everybody have a great rest of your day. We hope to see you again soon.
Keep talking transportation. Take care, y'all.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Nathan. That was awesome. Thank